Today's gospel reading comes from the 24th chapter of Luke, and it follows immediately the story that we read last week with the women and the tomb and the angels and all that stuff. And so our reading says, "Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, 'What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?' They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, 'Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?' And he asked them, 'What things?' They replied, 'The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it there just as the women had said, but they did not see him. Then he said to them, 'Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?' Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, 'Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over.' So he went in to stay with them. While he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. Then they said to each other, 'Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?' That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, 'The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon.' Then they told what had happened on the road, and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread." A rare day of blindingly brilliant sunshine, slightly exhausted feet, and a cloudless blue sky such as I have never seen, accompanied me at perhaps the holiest place on earth, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. After a long and crowded walk along the Via Dolorosa, the final steps of Christ, beginning with his trial at Pilate's palace, we had arrived there, the place where Jesus was crucified, died, and was buried, as we say in the Apostles' Creed. Just as the women in Luke's gospel diligently followed Jesus to the cross and eagerly checked the tomb 3 days later, I had made my own pilgrimage to this sacred space. It looks a bit different today, I imagine, than it did then. The crucifixion site is almost cluttered with silver lamps and golden statues, completely loaded with bling, as one of my fellow travelers put it. The tomb has received the same treatment. Icons, paintings, candles, vases of roses and lilies. We asked ourselves, is this really it? In the midst of all this shiny splendor, we were hoping to have a magical experience, a miraculous feeling of divine presence. As you may be able to tell, that's not quite how it went. I mean, we had touched all the things you were supposed to touch, the place where the cross stood, the place where they had washed and prepared his body, the tomb itself. And yet, after having done all this, all we really wanted to do was sit outside on the steps and soak up the sunshine until it was time for the group to leave. So that's what we did. A bit like the men heading toward Emmaus, disappointed over unmet expectations. We left the darkened, crowded church, walked right past the scores of the faithful who had made similar pilgrimages, and sat on the steps in the sun. While outside, my friends and I began to talk with a woman on our trip. Her name was Jody, and Jody was telling us all about her life at home. Her 3 little kids, her 2-point parish in northern Wisconsin, and her husband. She told us the story of how her husband was electrocuted 9 years ago when he was an electrician, and how he had been on disability since his accident. He's good with the kids, she told us, but sometimes he feels like another child. He doesn't like going out. He has trouble socializing. We listened to her story out there on those steps. We shared with her our sympathy and our empathy, but most importantly, we just listened as she talked about the meaningful people in her life and the everyday troubles that she faced. That night in our group sharing time, Jody spoke up. She said, "As we were at the church today, the only thing I could think about was when the angels in the empty tomb ask, 'Why do you seek the living among the dead?'" She continued to explain that, like the rest of us, she was expecting a holy and magical encounter at the church. I mean, who wouldn't have expected that? But she told us about how she had felt God's presence the most as she was sitting on those steps, talking with fellow believers and sharing in community. It took a trip to Israel for me to begin to learn what our story today is trying to teach us. The beauty of the resurrection is that God's presence has been set loose in the world. No longer is Jesus confined to a tomb. You can go look for yourself, like the women did, like Cleopas and his friend did 2,000 years ago, like Jody and I did a couple of years ago. He's not there. Instead, Jesus is busy running amok. Jesus lives with us, in us, and among us, even though we don't always recognize him. You see, Cleopas, Jody, you and I all have the same problem. We know exactly where Jesus should be. We know what he will look like, what he would do, where to go searching. I mean, we read the Bible, right? The prophecies told Cleopas and company what to expect. They did everything right, and Jesus messed it up somehow. They were hoping he was the one to redeem Israel. He said he'd be raised from the dead after 3 days, but they looked into the tomb and it was empty. Suddenly, their hopes and dreams were empty too. Jody and I went to the tomb ourselves, hoping that in a world as messy as ours, a spiritual light switch would suddenly be flicked on, or at least a spiritual inner lamp would be lit. Maybe if we traced the final steps, maybe if we touched the spot where the cross was, maybe if we stood in the long line to get into the tomb, then we'd find Jesus for sure, beyond a doubt. What about you? Where do you go looking for Jesus? Where do you expect Jesus to be? Maybe it's not in Israel. Maybe it's in personal devotional time. Maybe it's in the Bible. Maybe it's in nature. And I'm not saying those are bad places to encounter Jesus. I'm just asking, what if you come up dry? Granted, those are all good and likely places to find Jesus. I mean, if Jesus were to be anywhere, wouldn't you think Jerusalem would be a good place to start looking? But in this hide-and-go-seek game of finding Jesus, what if we wait, invite, and even expect Jesus to find us? Isn't that what happened to the men in today's story? Isn't that what happened to Jody in Jerusalem? The thing is, Jesus shatters our expectations. He blows right past them. We are indeed foolish and slow of heart if we refuse to look beyond what we think we know about who Jesus is and where to find him. When we truly encounter Christ, he opens our mind and explains further about himself and his ministry. He expands the ideas we hold and invites us to think beyond what we know. I've got news for you. The risen Christ is among you and is among us. He's the guy walking next to you. Jesus lives with us, in us, and among us. The only problem is that we haven't always the eyes to see him. But Jesus keeps sneaking in anyways, and we begin to see God in the ordinariness of our everyday lives. Sharing a meal, walking down the street, a kind word spoken in times of grief. But how will you know? How will you know that it's God? It will feel like love. You might remember the part of the story today when the two men talk about their hearts burning within them. This is how Greeks of that time talked about falling in love. Real, true, deep love is a fire in your chest, and you melt for the one who loves you. You melt for loving them. You are consumed by the power of this love, and you know it in the core of your being. I trust that you are familiar with this feeling. Maybe you felt it the day of your wedding. Maybe you felt it when you held your children for the first time. Maybe when you saw a moment of generosity and compassion between people. Whenever we feel this love, when we witness this love, when we encounter this love, we are seeing Jesus. We are being found by the living, breathing God in our midst. When was the last time that this love found you, snuck up on you, surprised you with beauty? Jody was found by Jesus while she was sitting on the limestone steps, leaning against the outer walls of what was a sacred space. The men in today's story were found by Jesus walking down the road, hearts full of disappointment and confusion. Nobody was expecting Jesus to be where he was, and yet Jesus seems to have found each of them and each of us anyways. We are invited to become more open, more artistic in recognizing how Jesus has already shown up in the everydayness of this lovely life. Instead of being held back as Cleopas was, as Jody was, as you and I are. Instead of being held back by expectations or doubts or what we think we know. Instead of being held back, we get to have our eyes opened. We begin to start to see the ways that the Spirit of God is with us, in us, and among us. God finds us and is present in unexpectedly ordinary times and places. I want to close with a poem by Emily Dickinson because she, of all people, seems to have understood this well. Her words seem appropriate for us as we go on our way, letting go of our expectations of where to find Jesus, and instead embracing the creative ways that Jesus has already shown up. She writes, "Who has not found heaven below will fail of it above. God's residence is next to mine. God's furniture is love. Let it be so."